Inma Pollito is a freelance artist who draws illustrations and comics. Several books and games feature her art. She also works on her own webcomics. I remember watching some YouTube tutorials from Inma back when I started to draw digitally, and later on seeing artworks from her webcomic The Violinist and the Nerd. The whimsical atmosphere in the art, the soft colors, as well as the variation of coloring styles Inma uses are inspiring and interesting to me. Today I'll share what I learned from studying Inma's art. We'll go through elements that are included in the art in the analysis part, and we'll use this for drawing an illustration afterwards. Inma uses line art with varying line thickness. At times there will also be empty spaces within the line art. Silhouette lines or lines that are in shadow tend to be thicker, while inner lines are thinner. The lines tend to have a dark brown color, but can also be slightly colored, often in a color that fits the surrounding colors. The characters Inma draws can be 6 to 8 heads tall, and they are slim. The bones of the characters can be a bit wider, while the limbs are not, leading to thin-looking bodies. Depending on the character, the proportions can vary as well. They tend to be more rounded and soft, but for male characters, they can also be more muscular, with broader shoulders. There is also some tapering included for the limbs. Hands are a bit long overall, and the fingers are more blocky for male characters than for female ones. Chibi characters are around 2 to 3 heads tall and have wider bodies. For chibi characters, the necks are very thin. For other characters, the necks are still rather thin but can also be wider for male characters. The necks are rather long, fitting the longer bodies. I also saw one illustration of Sakura from Cardcaptor Sakura, where the character looked around 5 heads tall. This appears to be an in-between of the regular sized bodies and the chibi ones. The face shape is rounded overall. The chin is rounded, but it can also be more pointy, and it often protrudes a bit. Distance-wise, the facial features are placed with generally equal spacing. However, the nose can be a bit higher up, especially for female characters or when the head angle changes. The upper part of the head also tends to be a bit longer, extending the 4 equal distances. Female characters have slightly more rounded, wider jaws, while male characters tend to have more pointy, narrow ones with a clearer change of direction in the face shape. For female characters, this change of direction can often disappear. The change of direction typically appears around mouth level, around the outer eye corner or ear level, though depending on the face angle and shape, it can also be placed differently. In the side view, the chin is a bit pointy and protrudes slightly forward. The nose also protrudes significantly, and the upper lip comes forward a bit, with the lower lip slightly protruding as well. The nose shape tends to be rounded at the bottom. Noses are mainly portrayed with 2 lines, one slightly rounded line for the nose bridge and one for the lower part of the nose. Sometimes a nostril is added as well, mostly for male characters. Male characters tend to have bigger noses overall. For some characters, only 1 line or 2 nostrils are drawn, making the nose appear smaller. Chibi characters may have just shadows representing the nose with no lines. Speaking of shadows, these are often added along with the lines on the nose bridge. In some cases, an outline is added to this shadow and a light may be added to the nose as well. In the side view, the nose appears rather wide and far forward for male characters. The overall nose is small and rounded, contributing to a cuter facial appearance. Mouths are portrayed with a line and sometimes a shadow. The mouth line is usually incomplete, with some gaps in between. The mouth corners are the thickest, while the inner parts appear thinner. An additional line below the mouth is sometimes added, representing the lower lip. A shadow at the lower lip is also added occasionally. The mouth is relatively small, especially for female characters. Another thing to note is that Inma sometimes draws small highlights or tongues for expressions. The inner part of the mouth is often quite saturated with color. In the side view, the upper lip protrudes more than the lower lip. Moving on to the eyebrows, these are thin, long lines that are often curved, making the facial expression appear softer. The inner part of the eyebrow is thicker than the outer part, and they tend to be spaced somewhat far apart, similar to the eyes, what we'll talk about next. The eyes are placed in the lower half of the face, with the distance between them sometimes being slightly greater than the width of one eye. The eye shape can be more rounded or square, with the outer side more rounded and the inner side more square and straight. Eyes for female characters are typically taller and more straight, while eyes for male characters are wider and more rounded. The upper shape of the eye can be either rounded or straight. With perspective changes, the further away eye will appear more squished. In the side view, the eyes take on an almost triangular shape. For the upper lash, some lashes can also be added to the shape, and smaller lines around the outer edge of the lower line portray small eyelashes there. The lines around the eye include a thicker line above the eye shape, especially at the inner part, and there may also be additional lines, such as 2 horizontal lines with 1 vertical line at the inner side connecting them. In other cases, there might just be 1 line and a horizontal line. The lines around the eye can vary. The iris has a big, rounded shape, not perfectly circular, but rather slightly squished or squared off in some cases. The iris appears overall taller and larger, but can also be smaller depending on the character. Here are the layers I would use to create eye shading similar to Inmas. First would be the base, next would be a shadow at the upper part of the eye. Sometimes a small circle extends into the lower part. After this we have an overlay at the bottom of the iris, often in circular or half circle shapes. And finally a reflected light in the shadow area in circular shapes. At times a gradient for the iris shadow would be added. The small pupil tends to have the color of the shadow. There are generally 4 levels of shading and colorful lights or details added. In the white of the eye, shadows are often added below the upper eyelid, sometimes with a slight tint, depending on the illustration. The darkest shadows around the eye are often placed at the eyeline's inner corner and below the eyebrow, other than a shadow caused by the hair. On the face, shadows are usually limited to blush below the eyes or at the sides of the face, sometimes with blush lines. Shadow outlines or face light lines are also used, and small dot highlights may be added to the skin. For eye shading highlights, these different kinds can be used. 1 big round shape in the iris or transitioning into the white of the eye. Sometimes smaller highlight shapes are added. For almost all characters, the most saturated parts of the skin are around the cheeks. Most hairlines are used for the silhouette, though inner lines are added as well. The hair strands often follow a specific shape structure that is repeated throughout the hairstyle. Incomplete lines are often used for inner strands. Hair shading usually consists of small zigzaggy shapes. Most of the hair tends to be in the light, with a few illustrations using round, blocky shading around the head. At times the hairlines are more saturated and gradients may be used. Here are the layers I would use for a hair shading similar to Inmas art. First is the base, next the shadow layer, then we have the light layer. After this would be a highlight layer. Finally, at times reflected light and or a soft glow around the face are added. The highlights are either small zigzag shapes or more blocky, rounded shapes. At times, lines that follow the hair's silhouette are included as well. Small flyaway hairs, which are not outlined, may also be added, often as thin strands. Clothes typically have thicker lines for silhouettes and thinner ones for folds. Folds are often portrayed with lines, though some may be portrayed purely through shading. Incomplete lines are also common in the depiction of clothes. Inmas characters tend to wear simple, modern, casual outfits. Shirts, pants, jackets, scarves or bags are common. Patterns may also be added. Inma tends to use bright pastel colors, often with a pinkish hue, though the palette can vary. Her color choices are rather warm, and various colors tend to be combined. In this one illustration, the very bright colors contrast heavily with the black shadows. This is an exception to Inma's other illustrations, where shadows don't add that much contrast, giving the art more of a pastel, soft look. With that, let's move on to the shading next. A large part of Inma's illustrations is in the light. Cell shading with clear edges is used, though it can also be more blended and painterly with still relatively defined edges. The shadow shapes sometimes have darker edges and small lighting outlines are added frequently as well. Shadow colors are typically darker and more saturated. Shadows are more rounded and soft overall. Shading layers include first the base, then a first shadow layer, next second shadow layer, and finally a light layer. I used the second shadow layer here to add hue variation, though at times just a base and shadow layer is enough. Process-wise, I would use a brush with full or varying opacity, either lasso selecting areas or painting them directly to draw in the shadows. For backgrounds, Inma often combines simple bright colors with minimalistic graphic elements, such as text, lines, flowers, or similar patterns. Full scenes, like cities or houses with flowers, are also an option. Textures are also frequently used in her backgrounds. Inma uses Clip Studio Paint for her illustrations and often makes use of the assets from its asset library. As mentioned earlier, she also draws webcomics, and for this, using the asset library to create backgrounds and scenes is immensely helpful as it saves a lot of time. Extra effects that are added can also include particles, highlights, flower petals, sparkles and small shapes such as squares or stars. Next, let's move on to drawing an illustration in the art style. I drew my OC Yumari here, who I have drawn in my past art style studies. It's always nice to see how this turns out, so let's start with the process. First, I sketched in a pose thumbnail. I made the pose a bit smaller after adding some guidelines to make sure the body proportions would work. Then I sketched in the head. I made the head shape rounded and gave him a gentle smile as expression. For his eyes, I drew the lashes turned downwards, so it aligns with Yumari's design. The eyebrows being soft, rounded and thin as well as high up add to his happy, gentle expression. Then I started sketching in the hair. I used thinner, flowy shapes for this. After the hair, I moved on to the body. Here I used soft, round proportions. I enjoyed sketching in the hand pose especially. After the body, I moved on to the outfit. For this, I like to adapt Yumari's initial outfit a bit so it fits to the artist I'm studying. Here I kept his shoulder free cut and tried adding more of a sweater cuff for the material of his outfit and the sleeve. To further emphasize the casual aesthetic, I added these sweater strings as well. Then I added the thinner parts over his shoulder and some accessoires, including earrings and rings. After this, I had the idea of adding a hood, so I sketched this in, once wider and once with a thinner shape. Next, I filled in the silhouettes for the head and hair, adjusting this a bit, and then I blocked in the anatomy as well. Through this, I discovered the chest was a bit too low at first. The final thing I added in the sketching phase were some ideas for the background. After this, I moved on to line art. I started with the face. I paid attention to drawing in the inner lines for the features thinner while keeping the face outline thicker. Something that was pretty different from how I usually draw would be doing the incomplete lines for the eyebrows. Then for the hair, I made especially the lines at the forehead where two lines intersect thicker. For the outfit and body, I also made the silhouette lines thicker and the inner lines thinner. I also used some thin incomplete lines for the inner part of the sweater cuffs. Overall, the face outline is the thickest and darkest line from the line art here. I adjusted the line art a bit and added in the background elements next. Now we're done with the line art, let's move on to the colors next. I filled these in first, then I restructured my document so I would be able to use the same shading systems as determined from my analysis. For the shading, I first painted in a block-in on a layer over everything to figure out where I would like the shadows to be before starting to shade. I used the color palettes from my analysis and adjusted them so it would fit to the colors in the illustration. After this, I started shading. Here I used the lasso selection tool, mostly since a lot of Inmas work features cell shading. I made the nose and mouth shading softer for the face. I also just painted the second darker shadow color on the skin, making the shadow edges here appear a bit softer. The part below the face is the darkest for the skin color here, because of the shadow the head is casting and the top-down bright lighting setup I went with here. This also frames the face, adding emphasis to it. Adding the blush added some liveliness to the face. What can add a lot of liveliness as well would be the eyes, and I shaded these next. I added a pinkish hue for the bottom light and a blue reflective light at the top. I like this contrast of warm and cool colors, it makes the eyes stand out. Next is the hair. Here I started with lasso, selecting small thin long strands. I filled them in and erased some parts, lowering the opacity in some areas. Then I added light at the top of the head. This enhances the depth of the head, portraying its spherical shape. After painting over some edges here, softening them, I reselected the area in light. I painted in a gradient, adding a darker color directly beneath the area in light. After painting in highlights, I wanted to add some shading at the top of the head. I was unsure if I wanted this to only be in a circular shape above the highlights or only at the hair part. Since I didn't like how all the versions looked, I decided to not go with this shadow. After the hair, I moved on to the outfit, starting with the bright blue parts. I mostly used painterly round strokes for this to add softness. I found adding the lights especially interesting since it added some shininess. After the outfit shading, including the silver accessoires, was done, I adjusted some colors. The bright blue part of the shirt looked a bit plain to me, so I added some small star sparkle patterns. After this, I colored the lines by duplicating copies of the merge color layer and clipping this to the line art layer, a technique I also use for my other illustrations. I also blurred some copies of the line art to make it softer. Then I added in highlights for the eyes and painted over a few parts. Finally, I worked more on the background, adjusting the colors and adding a white border. I added some small particles as well and adjusted the stars and moons I added as background elements. I was unsure whether to make them white or have them be grey. I wanted Yumari to stand out from the background and the elements, but I also wanted the elements to be visible. I also tried adding some outlines with layer effects to make the background elements appear different. Then I added in some textures as final touches and adjusted the colors and contrast. I wanted to add some more vibrancy and softness through this. After painting over the eyes, the illustration was done. Let's move on to a reflection of this art style study next. If you have any other thoughts, you can leave them in the comments. I hope what I mentioned can be of help to you. To begin with, I determined some differences I see between my and Inma's art. First would be that the lines in my art are darker and more separate from the colors, especially the lines around the hair are too dark. What also stood out to me for the hair especially would be that there's a bit too much contrast in my illustration overall. The eyes have more contrast than the rest of the illustration in Inma's art, whereas for my art the contrast is around the same throughout the image. Lastly, I would add the iris shape. It's a bit longer for Inma's eyes. In my artwork the iris looks kind of flat as well. Next, let's see how the illustration will change when I go over these things I mentioned. I started with making the line art lighter. For this I used my old line art layer and selected this. Then I filled in a purple color and set it to overlay. I also copied and pasted the selected line art area from my merged color and line art layer and set this to screen. Then I selected the area around the eyes and inverted my selection to apply a filter mask that would decrease the contrast a bit. To make the hair have even less contrast and appear softer, I used my old hair color group and selected the darker parts. I set this to screen as well and checked the values afterwards. Next I worked a bit on the eyes. I painted over them, adjusting the shape of the iris. I also used Liquify a few times to adjust the eyes placement on the head and their shape. Finally, I wanted to add a texture to the background. For this I used a previously imported watercolor texture and made it more visible on the background. With these adjustments made, here's a before and after of my illustration of Yumari. After the differences, I would point out my learnings next. First would be using textures and patterns. Inma often does this and it adds some unique detail. Alongside this I would mention using assets, whether it's for the backgrounds, characters or as extra effects. In some of her tutorials Inma included how she uses Clip Studio Paint's assets, which can definitely add a lot to your illustration and help to save time. I also find Inma's art shows how you can make your art appear more soft and cute. Inma adds soft gradients, small particles, highlights and uses bright pastel colors in general. The outfits the characters wear often fit a cute, more simple and calm aesthetic as well. Those would be some of my learnings. Do you have any other thoughts or feedback? Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments. I focused on the colored and shaded illustrations in this video since that's what I draw most myself. If you are more interested in drawing comics, you can definitely look more into the way Inma draws comics and tips she has for this. She shares a lot of advice on Clip Studio Paints and her own YouTube channel. I'll leave links to this and Inma's other social media platforms in the video description. You can check it out. If you're interested in seeing some of my longer screen recorded process videos, time lapses and full resolution images of my art, you can find this on my Patreon. Thank you for watching, have a nice day and bye.